The monitors were showing data that could not be correct, and I had been staring at them for 4 minutes before I admitted that to myself. The human was under full suppression, 93% cortical silence on the SAReth-9 array, verified by 2 independent probes at different cranial sites. No discernible volitional activity. No command signal. By every model of nervous system function in the Continuance Surgical Institute's 400-year archive, she was, for all practical purposes, not present in her own body. Her lungs were moving. Not irregularly. Not in residual muscle tremor the way a Vithari patient might show for the first 30 seconds after full cortical suppression. Rhythmically. 11 cycles per minute, tidal volume consistent, airway pressure clean. The chest wall rose and fell as though she were simply asleep, the ordinary sleep of a person who had not been disconnected from the part of herself that decides to breathe. I ran an instrument check. The probe read correctly against the calibration phantom. I ran it again. 93% suppression on both channels. The lungs continued. I called Preventha Sareth-Vel into the suite. She was my senior colleague by 11 years and had administered continuance-grade suppression to 49 species across her career. She looked at the readout for perhaps 8 seconds without speaking, then looked at the patient, then back at the readout. "Is the probe seating correctly?" she asked. "It is." She read the numbers again. The human's chest rose, fell, rose. "Run a cardiovascular index," Preventha said. I had already started it. The result came back while she was still watching the screen. Heart rate, 61 beats per minute. Blood pressure, 117/74. Peripheral resistance, nominal. The cardiovascular system was maintaining itself with a precision that a conscious Vithari patient on a calm morning could not reliably produce. It was not compensating for the suppression. It did not appear to know the suppression was happening. Preventha stood very still for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "Pull the cross-species baseline for autonomic persistence post-cortical suppression." I knew what it would show. I pulled it anyway, because the alternative was standing in a room where something was happening that I could not name, and I needed names. The archive returned results for 211 species. Every graph curved the same way. Autonomic function degraded steeply within the first 90 seconds of full cortical suppression, stabilizing at a maintenance floor that required active pharmaceutical support to sustain. Several species showed complete autonomic cessation within 4 minutes without intervention. That was the model. That was what every continuance textbook described as the relationship between conscious direction and bodily function. The one depended on the other. The human's lung cycle completed its 11th iteration since I had been counting. I said, "She is not on autonomic support." "I see that," Preventha said. "She has not been on autonomic support since induction." "I know." We looked at each other. In 31 years of practice, I had never had a reason to look at a colleague the way I looked at Preventha Sareth-Vel in that moment. We were not afraid exactly. We were recalibrating, which is a thing that looks very much like fear from the inside. I began logging subsystems. Respiratory, autonomous. Cardiovascular, autonomous. I added thermal regulation. Her core temperature had not shifted by more than 0.3 of a degree since induction, which meant the peripheral circulatory system was making continuous microadjustments entirely without instruction. I added the spinal reflex arc. When I applied calibrated pressure to the dorsal surface of her left hand, the fingers flexed away. Not a seizure pattern, a clean withdrawal reflex. The spinal cord had processed the stimulus and produced a response. Her brain had not been consulted. I added that one to the log. I kept going. Immune modulation, active 3 elevated cytokine markers consistent with her body identifying the surgical prep compounds as minor irritants and mounting a proportional response. Gut motility, continuing. Pupillary response to the overhead array, bilateral, equal, appropriate to the light level. Bone marrow activity, undisturbed. Endocrine baseline, nominal. By the time I reached 17 entries, I stopped counting and called the methodology review panel. They arrived in 40 minutes. 3 examiners, Sareth Velkan, who chaired xenobiological assessment for the Institute, his associate Privath San, who had authored the current edition of the Continuance Cross-Species Suppression Protocol, and a third examiner, Oreth Velsan, whom I knew only by reputation as a careful and difficult man who did not revise his conclusions without compelling cause. The human's chest was still moving when they walked in. Oreth Velsan looked at the monitors, looked at the patient, and then said the same thing Preventha had said an hour before. Is the probe seating correctly? I did not answer him. I gestured to the instrument log, which showed 6 independent verification runs across 2 probe types and an external cross-check by Preventha's own calibrated unit. He read it without comment. His expression, which had begun as skeptical and professional, became something quieter. Sareth Velkan pulled the archive himself. He ran the cross-species comparison on the main display, widening the search to all catalog species in the Continuance Xenobiological Registry, 419 entries. Every curve degraded. Every one. The shortest survival window without autonomic pharmaceutical support was 11 minutes, in a species that used a partially redundant nervous architecture the Institute had considered remarkable until this afternoon. He let the display sit for a long time. Privath San pulled a secondary query, filtering only for species that employed any form of distributed nervous architecture, decentralized signaling, or redundant processing nodes. He wanted to know whether anything in the registry suggested a partial precedent, something that might explain the data by degrees rather than wholesale. The query returned 9 species. He opened each profile in sequence. 3 used redundant pathways to compensate for limb-level damage, but their central cortical suppression curves degraded normally. 4 employed secondary ganglionic clusters for environmental sensing, none of which sustained cardiovascular function independently. The remaining 2 were colonial organisms with no individual nervous system to speak of. Not comparable. He closed the last profile. There is nothing close, he said. What is the mechanism? Privath San asked. He was not asking me. He was asking the display, which did not answer. I told them what I had been able to determine in the time I had. The human nervous system was not organized as a single hierarchy with the cortex at its apex. It was layered, a set of semi-independent functional networks, each capable of sustaining its own operation without reference to the network above it. The brain handled volition, cognition, language, the things the human was aware of herself doing. Below that, the brainstem managed breathing, heartbeat, the fundamental machinery. Below that, the spinal cord ran its own reflexes. Below that, every organ system carried its own local signaling architecture, the gut with its own nerve plexus, the vasculature with its own pressure-sensing loops, the immune system operating on a communication network that did not route through the brain at all. When you suppress the cortex, you suppress the human. The body continued because the body was not only the human. It was 17 other things as well, and none of them required her permission to function. Oreth Velsan was the one who spoke first after I finished. He said, in a trauma scenario, severe damage to the central cortical architecture, this body would continue to attempt to maintain itself. Yes, I said. For how long? I looked at him. I don't know. The archive has no ceiling for it. The Sareth 9 system has never seen a data point to establish one. He nodded once very slowly. That was all. We waited for the suppression cycle to complete. When the human came back, when, as I now understood it, the human returned to a body that had been running steadily in her absence. She blinked at the overhead array, oriented herself, and asked whether the pre-surgical assessment had gone well. Preventha told her it had been unremarkable. She thanked us and asked whether she could have water. I brought it to her myself. I am not sure why. I watched her drink it and thought about the 17 entries in my log and the 419 curves on the archive display, and the 11-minute sealing of the most remarkable nervous architecture we had previously recorded, and I did not say anything. She handed the cup back to me. Her hand was steady. I filed the report that evening. 17 autonomous subsystems confirmed. Cross-species comparison. No prior precedent located. New classification recommended. Distributed autonomic independence. Grade unassigned. Pending methodology panel review. The archive query I submitted alongside it was simple. I asked whether any continuance-registered species had been documented to continue basic physiological function, following complete cortical suppression, without pharmaceutical support for longer than 11 minutes. The query returned no results. I sat with that for a while. Then I added a single line to the report, under the section reserved for clinical observations of significance. It read, "The body does not appear to require the patient in order to remain alive. The relationship between the two appears to be, in some fundamental sense, optional." I did not know what to do with that. I still do not. I closed the file, submitted it to the panel, and went home. I slept very badly. I'm not sure what I was thinking about exactly. Only that somewhere across the city, in a recovery suite on the 14th floor of the Institute, something was breathing and adjusting and maintaining itself, and had been doing so continuously since long before the woman inside it was born, and would likely continue doing so long after she stopped paying attention. It did not need to be told. It simply did not stop.